Hello, this is Wes Bridle, and this is another Kingdom Calling economic update. And this is the second part in a three-video series we're doing, which is basically the economic news of the past week and a half. And this one we're going to focus on hyperinflationary signs. Again, we ended the last video with Sir John Templeton's note about that coming. And there are a bunch of scary things that are happening, so I'm going to jump right in them. Bill Gross, who is the largest bond investor in the world, he runs PIMCO funds and is probably the greatest bond investor in the world, says bonds have seen their best days. So there's a lot of people out there that say they don't see inflation, but here you have the greatest bond investor in the world that does see this coming down the road. Portugal was downgraded recently, and this past week, and it's making investors nervous. There are all these things that are happening. We mentioned in the previous update about Greece, and we talked about Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Spain being potential problems. Well, Portugal has now been downgraded. It's making investors nervous about all sovereign bonds. They're looking around at these countries and saying, is it really wise for me to be lending money to these countries? Is the money that they pay me back going to be worth anything? And so the more countries that have problems, the more investors look around and get nervous. So it's very likely more countries have problems, and then that boomerangs on us, and people begin to examine us more quickly. Very interesting news out of Japan. The Japanese pension, which is just a massive pension, way bigger than any pension we have in the U.S., has now become a seller of Japanese bonds. So they've been the biggest buyer for years. They have a tremendous amount of money. They're the biggest holder of Japanese bonds. And Japan, if you remember, has far more debt than any other country, maybe Zimbabwe being the exception. But they have a ridiculous amount of debt, but they've been able to do that because their Japanese people save a lot of money. Their businesses are very productive and generate a lot of cash from around the world, and that money gets saved in these Japanese bonds. So whereas we try to, or we do, run our deficits and our debt based on a lot of foreign lending to us, the Japanese are able to do it primarily from their own people. But their population is aging and is actually older than our population. They have the same baby boomer issue, but they're ahead of the curve on that. And so they now have, the guy that runs the Japanese pension is saying that he will now be a net seller. So here's the biggest buyer of Japanese bonds that now is going to be a net seller starting this year because they've got more people retiring, more people that he needs to pay out. And so that's huge. Also, the $2.3 trillion of Japanese bonds needs to be refinanced the rest of this year. It's an ominous sign for the second half of this year. Again, as if the Japanese yen has a problem, that just causes people to get nervous about about any currency and start to look and figure out what's going on with other currencies. So we have to ask ourselves, how does our currency look? And let's look at a few things. We know that healthcare legislation passed last week. That was a really big deal. And the CBO, the Congress used a CBO number where they said that it wasn't going to have a problem or negative effect on the deficit. But a former CBO director just looked at the numbers, and what he said is the CBO is not allowed to think about what realistically will happen. They have to take the legislation at face value. So he looked at what would realistically happen, and he said that it would have a negative impact of $562 billion a year on the deficit. That's $500 billion extra dollars we lose every year and have to borrow every year. The trustees that run Social Security and Medicare for the Treasury reported, and we've talked about this a lot, but this is the first time I've actually seen that the government reporting these numbers. It's been well known, but the government is actually reporting these numbers. They know Social Security has an unfunded $15 trillion liability. Medicare, $36.4 trillion. So it's over $50 trillion of money that the government knows it's going to have to pay out that it does not have. If any person or company had anything like that, it would have to be on the books. Somehow our government does not put that on our books, but they are committed to it. It's a serious problem. And then if we look at how's Social Security doing? Is that just a problem that's down the road? For years and years we've been saying Social Security is going to have a problem someday, but that's down the road. economists were thinking, it's a guess, but 2016 would be the year this became a negative problem. Well, actually now the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, and Social Security have come out and said, actually it's this year that the problem is here. We've hit the tipping point, and that Social Security will now pay out more this year than they're paying in. So for years our Congress has been using the Social Security surplus and spending it on other things instead of putting it away for you like theoretically they should be doing. Instead they've been spending that money. Well, this year they won't have that to spend, and they're going to have extra money to pay out to Social Security beneficiaries that they've never had to do before. So we're at that tipping point. Finally, the Fed put out a Z1 document for the fourth quarter, and these are annualized numbers for debt. Households and businesses are both decreasing the amount of debt, but state and local governments are increasing at 4.7%, the U.S. government at 10.7%. So the individuals in the country are kind of getting the message to some degree. The government is not at all. It's ballooning the amount of debt. So while people around the world are getting nervous about sovereign debt, our country is still cranking away, producing more and more debt at a time when we should really be pulling back. So how are the Treasury auctions doing? Last week there were 2-year and 5-year auctions, and they showed huge problems. There were few buyers, fewer than normal, showing up to actually buy and bid on these bonds, and they ended up having to pay at higher rates. Now, this is shocking, but the 2-year auction, the U.S. government is paying a higher percentage for the 2-year money than a recent Berkshire auction. So they're paying more than Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's company, than Procter & Gamble, Johnson & Johnson, and Lowe's companies. That should never be, that shouldn't even be possible. The U.S. borrowing rate has always been considered the risk-free rate. The reality is they can print. They don't really have to be in danger of not paying back their money, their obligations, because they print the money. It's easy for them to print more money and pay it back. So they should always have a lower interest rate than any other company introducing bonds in U.S. dollars, because they have to actually earn the money to pay it back. But investors are saying they trust those companies more than the U.S. government. It's a weird anomaly, but it's a big sign of what's to come in the U.S. dollar. I hope you're ready. Again, if you haven't watched The Coming Storm, please do so. These are incredible times, and it's going to be like nothing you've ever thought of before. And we want to help you prepare. Thanks for watching, and God bless you.